On today's Hear These Words, we hear David, King David, being a bad boy and abusing his power with Uriah, Bathsheba's husband. And we hear Paul encouraging us with an incredible benediction of love of Christ that surpasses all understanding and knowledge. And finally, we look at the movement of our life in faith from a fear of scarcity to a faith life of abundance in the passage of the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. Don't worry about mechanics, but instead look for God's miraculous intervention in your life and in mine. Today on Hear These Words. Welcome to Hear These Words, a podcast and video series from Good Shepherd Episcopal Church in beautiful Tequesta, Florida. I'm Sanford Grotham, the rector here, and it is a privilege to welcome you to this week where we discuss the passages of Scripture assigned for each upcoming Sunday. This Sunday is the 10th Sunday after Pentecost, proper 12b, and the words we hear are 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 1 through 5, Psalm 14, Ephesians 3, verses 14 through 21, and John 6, verses 1 through 21. Well, it's great to have you this morning. It's morning here whenever you're listening to this or watching it. I'm obviously by myself. Father Derek's last Sunday was just a few days ago, and of course I miss him. I don't even know how to sit. He's gone, but we are keeping him and his family in our prayers as he heads up to St. Peter's Episcopal Church as the rector in Plant City. So you're stuck with me for a little while. I think we'll make this kind of interesting, I hope. We do have some interesting passages from the lectionary, and we'll probably have a few guests as well on here as we get into the swing of things by myself. Enjoy these few weeks, though, because I have a feeling we will be able to not be alone for that long. We're never alone, of course, and it's great to be with you on this particular day as we take a look at the Scripture for this week. The first lesson is from the Old Testament, 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 1 through 15. And this is where we have David and Bathsheba. I'm sure you've heard of David and Bathsheba. King David, of course, sees Bathsheba bathing out on the, kind of in the house, and he's looking down from the rooftop. And of course, Bathsheba is the wife of Uriah. Uriah is a warrior from another area. And so David sends word, send me Uriah the Hittite. And so Uriah, of course, comes, and David wants to kind of get to know Uriah, perhaps. He's got mixed motives, of course. And Uriah keeps talking about how he needs to be down, not up in the high places with David, but down with the servants, down with the warriors, that he considers his role as a humble servant. And so he keeps going down while David keeps inviting him up. Even toward the end, on the next day, David invited Uriah to eat and drink in his presence and made him drunk. And in the evening, he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of his Lord, but he did not go down to his house. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. In the letter, he wrote, set Uriah at the forefront of the hardest fighting and then draw back from him so that he may be struck down and die. Here we have a story about corruption of power. Corruption of power. King David, has come quite a far way since his defeat of Goliath, where he was the scrappy underdog who we were rooting for and who ended up defeating big bad Goliath, and now we see David in the very throes of power, and we see a contrast. There's a contrast between where David is, kind of high up, and now he doesn't go to the battle, he sends a word. And now he doesn't go down to be with the people. He has them, send Uriah up to me. He has them come to him. He's even with Bathsheba, watching her from a distance. And then of course he does have relations with her and she becomes pregnant. And that pregnancy is kind of what sparks the whole deal with Uriah, where he starts getting nervous about that, and then even sending word that Uriah should go to the forefront of the hardest fighting so that he might be struck down and die. It is quite the contrast from humble Uriah, who won't even go down to his own house, but instead lays on the couch with the servants around him. He keeps himself low, not going up to those places of privilege and power, but instead staying down and humble so that he might continue to be in his place. We get this contrast. 2 Samuel, the author seems to be setting up a contrast so that we can see how David's power has led to his corruption. Now, it would be easy in this passage to blame everything on David, to make this about David himself and say he's being bad, right? He's being morally corrupt, and I don't want to excuse him. So that's a fine line of inquiry. I think that's fine. I think for today, though, we have another line or avenue by which we might glean a little bit from this passage. And that is that we all find ourselves looking up and down to places of power with the biggest of people, especially in these last couple of weeks where there has been a lot in the news, a lot in the news, but where we hear all about the White House and we hear about the halls of Congress and the Supreme Court bench, and we see people of much power, and we analyze and we see whether they're using that power judiciously. 2 weeks ago, we saw Herod and John the Baptist and that abuse of power. And so it's easy to kind of look up and have your stomach churn at those, in higher places who abuse their power. But we ought not forget to look down from wherever we sit in our own places of power and privilege in this world and in our own culture, where we might look down and see those who might not be in similar places to us, but rather who might be like Uriah. And when we refuse to step out of our own places that might be powerful and privileged, we too might examine our own actions. And so here we have a little bit of a moral cautionary tale. I don't know if I would, push it too far, but I do think that we all find ourselves at the intersection of various power dynamics culturally. And it's a good thing to keep in mind, and that we should, as often as we can, try to model our life after Uriah, recognizing our own place and approaching that with humility rather than with the kind of pompous certainty that David does, where he goes and kind of acts out of his own self-interest. So a little bit of a heavy first reading from 2 Samuel this morning, and I hope that we continue to meditate on that a little bit. For Psalm 14, I actually would encourage us to take 5 minutes, not right now, but take 5 minutes when you can, and read it twice. I would read it the first time just straight through and allow yourself to hear it, but also allow your mind to kind of wander as it kind of glimpses that. And then I would wait about 90 seconds. And then I would read it again. And this time, allow your mind to be more clear. Try to release those things that are occupying your mind on the first reading. And see whether on that second reading, there's something about this psalm that just sticks out to you. Something that you, a word or a phrase or an image that speaks into your own life. And then allow that word to become a bit of a prayer. And allow that prayer to be said for the rest of the day. So I pray that the psalm would be a blessing, especially in our own reading and our praying practice of it. Ephesians 3:14 through 21. Here we have quite the opposite of the abuse and corruption of power that we found in 2 Samuel. Here we have the first words, I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and earth takes its name. Here we have Paul speaking toward humility and trying to recognize his own place in God's economy. I really love this passage because as we move through, we get this great blessing or benediction from Paul, that God may grant you that you may be strengthened in your inner being with the power of his Spirit, and that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, as you are being rooted and grounded in love. And I pray that you may have the power to comprehend with all the saints the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, so that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. It's a wonderful, poetic prayer and benediction. It is something that I hope we can allow to ring in our ears and in our hearts, so that we might remember that God, that love of Christ is so all-encompassing. It's just a gift that kind of brings us all the way around with all the saints, with everyone else. That breadth, length, height, and depth. One of my favorite, I guess, I've got a lot of favorites, but one of my favorites, Teresa of Avila, she writes about the interior castle, the rooms of our lives. She looks at the rooms of the castle as a metaphor for our own spiritual progression in Christ. And there are 7 rooms. And she, one of the things that she says as she gets deeper into the rooms is that the time spent in those rooms becomes actually less and less the deeper you go. You spend a lot of time in the outer rooms, 1, 2, 3, but as you get deeper in, you spend less and less time there. However, the time that you do end up spending in those deeper rooms becomes so profound and so impactful that it completely changes you as you kind of go back out to the more outer rooms, back to your life. That those, as I've said before, mountaintop moments, we don't live on the mountain, but the mountaintop moments change us for as we come back down into our everyday life. And I think that this here, I pray that you may have the power to comprehend with all the saints. The power to comprehend is not necessarily a day-to-day, I've got to remember and I've got to think about and I've got to be intentional necessarily, although intention is good for the most part, but rather that there would be a moment for you, a moment where you are filled with the breadth and length and height and depth of the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, that's beyond even the scope of our understanding, so that after that moment, life is totally changed. It's a different beast altogether. and that we would walk through this world in a way that is, as Paul says, strengthened for God in God's service, strengthened by the power of the Holy Spirit. And I believe that that's what we're about, and that's really what we do on Sundays. I mean, that's when we gather together. That heavenly feast around the Eucharistic altar, around the table, is meant to give us that strength and that feeding, so that we might go forth the rest of the week changed and nourished. I think that's pretty good. Onward and upward. John 6, 1 through 21. Before we jump into this passage here, we are going to be spending the next 5 weeks on John 6. This is the Bread of Life Discourse is what it's called. John 6, kind of a longer chapter, and the lectionary writers in this year B, have us running through that week after week for 5 weeks. So John has a particular way of writing about this, and this first passage, 6, 1 through 21, a fairly long passage. He actually puts in two stories, two miracles, so it is, and that we're just going to get used to John's voice for the next 5 weeks. So hang in there, and it should be great. But here we get in John 6, the beginning of John 6, 1 through 21, we get the feeding of the 5,000. And after the feeding of the 5,000, we also have Jesus kind of stealing away after they try to make him king. And then he heads out onto the boat he heads out onto the sea. And they see Jesus walking on the sea during a storm. And again, two kind of miraculous moments here. And the first, the feeding of the 5,000, a wonderful story, wonderful passage. And I like to think about this, I kind of like to think about this from the perspective of the disciples. And the Passover was near, and the disciples start to get nervous because they see these people, they see these crowds. And of course they begin to kind of put things in logical order. The people are coming, they're going to be here, they're going to be watching. The Passover's coming. We've got to feed them. They've got to have food. Where are they going to get food? And they find this boy who's got the 5 barley loaves and the 2 fish. And Jesus kind of says, well, go ahead and make them sit down. And, there's the 5,000 and the 4,000. This is the 5,000. The 4,000 takes place at night. But the 5,000, as far as we can tell, is during the day. And he has them sit down, and then takes the food, says the grace, and then breaks them and begins to distribute them. Now, from my perspective, as I think about the disciples, when we read the passage, we sometimes rush to the end. I sometimes rush to the end. And I think, oh, wow, they fed 5,000 people. But just think about that for a minute. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of carrying of food back and forth. And even if you have a whole, if you have 100, 200 people running food runners, it's hours worth of work. And every time the disciples run the food out, they come back thinking that's going to be it. There's more, right? There's another basket. There's another filling of the food so that they can run it out. And then even after they're finished, after the whole day's over, they go and gather up what's left over. And from the fragments of the 5 loaves and 2 fish, they had 12 full baskets. And they kind of realize with that something miraculous has happened, that Jesus has managed to feed so many out of so few. Now, Um, I think it's one thing to ask a reasonable question, which is how? How did this happen? What was the exact miraculous mechanism by which it happened? Did bread appear out of thin air? Although like a magic trick where they came up with their basket and Jesus, they see kind of something invisible turn visible and there it was. Did they not see that? The scriptures in this and in the feeding of the 4,000 does not report anything like that. It does not report the mechanism by which the miracle happened. That doesn't seem to be the eyewitness account, and it doesn't seem to be the author's interest to tell us the disciple went back with an empty basket of bread and held the basket out to Jesus, and Jesus waved his hand over the basket and bread and fish appeared in the basket. That's not of interest here. And so when we think about miracles, we tend to think in those terms. We tend to think in magic terms. How did the magic happen? How did the miracle happen? What was the mechanism by which it happened? But that's not the point. The point is that the disciples came in, and maybe even the crowds came in with expectations and fears that there wasn't going to be enough. They came in with a scarcity mindset. And what they ended up doing throughout the day, through their work, is as they continued to work and run food back and forth, they began to see the abundance. They began to see the abundance of God's generosity. They began to see the miraculous provision of Jesus, who continued to provide food, bread, and fish to 5,000 people. And then at the end, when really they should have been out, there was more than enough. It wasn't just that they fed everyone a pittance. It wasn't that they just fed them enough, just the bare minimum. It's that they fed them so much that even after everyone was fed to the point of overeating, right? An all-you-can-eat buffet, if you will, they still had 12 baskets. And I just, again, thinking about today, how often do I, look at something, look at my time, my money, my possessions, look at the people in church, look at the ability to do programming, look at how many priests we have, and get nervous that we're fearful that the scarcity is going to end up having us run short. And scarcity is real, right? Scarcity is real. It is not a figment of our imagination that the resources are scarce oftentimes. And yet I think this miracle invites us to witness God's provision in action, to witness places and times in our own life, like the disciples, where we are nervous and fearful that we are going to run out. And then as we get about the work we have to do, we find an abundance and we experience an abundance. And there's you can look at that as an accountant, as a bean counter, and you can say, oh, well, that makes perfect sense. We had X number of beans, Y number of beans, and accountants are very important in the church. We get our audit done. We have all the numbers lined up. But there's also a divine way to look at this, a way of, with eyes of gratitude, where you look at your own perspective as fearful, and then you realize at the end of the day and through the process of your work that there's actually an abundance and that there's more than enough. And to say, oh, I did that, to say that was me, well, now you're kind of heading back into David's territory up on that roof, kind of up on that high palace. I would encourage instead to say, God has provided yet again. God has inspired this community yet again. There is an abundance of and a generous outpouring to the point where we are full. We're full. To me, that's the miracle. It is that God provides, and that when you have eyes of faith, you see that provision everywhere you turn. You see that provision helping to combat the fear of scarcity that infects our hearts. And if we're able to have those eyes of faith where we see the feeding of the 5,000 day after day after day after day after day, it really does, fill us. Fill us in a way that I think Paul would echo in Ephesians, fills us with that breadth and length and height and depth of the love of Christ. That, because that's one of the key tenets of our faith is to bear witness, to share that good news, to see God in our midst. And I think that when we look at miracles as mechanics and magic, I think we really sell God short. I think we're actually kind of short-sighted on our own life and God's action and work in it. But when we see the movement from fear to faith, from fear to abundance, from fear to provision or scarcity to plenty, I think then we are beginning to understand with our heart the miracle of God's presence in our life. And so I pray that, these passages would speak to you this week. I've got to preach about them on Sunday, so we'll see. I feel like I've already preached this morning, so we'll see what happens on Sunday. Some great passages, though. It should be great. And I want to say thank you for joining me today. You can join me every week and never miss an episode by subscribing to our YouTube channel or wherever you happen to listen to your podcasts. And you can share it with your friends because, as Father Derek always said, it's always good to share. If you liked what you heard, please consider giving us a like, and we look forward to worshiping with you this Sunday. And we hope that now you feel a little more prepared to hear these words. We'll see you soon.